All right, so let's be making our way in our Bibles over to actually 1 Samuel 25. There's a couple of things I wanted to mention about verses that we didn't get time to look at last week. So we know that in where we left off last week, right, David has not killed Nabal. Abigail talked him out of it, and we saw that it was for good reason. Because we read about Nabal dying from a stroke, and as obviously, as was said in chapter 25, and I believe it was verse 39 or verse 38, that God had a hand in that. David recognized that, and as a result, Abigail's without a husband, and David, who, as we mentioned, recognized Abigail's worth, decides to marry Abigail. And that's where we left off last time, and I wanted to just mention a couple of things about chapter 25, verses 43 through 44. You also note that in verse 43 that David takes another wife, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and as the text says, they were also both of them his wives. If I'm not mistaken, I believe, we'll talk about it in 2 Samuel, but one of David's sons named Amnon, who figures prominently with Absalom, what I believe was the son of Ahinoam. Dad, if I'm wrong on that, correct me, but I believe that's the case. I think it was last week that I looked at that. But he marries another wife. He takes Abigail, marries her. He also marries, again, Ahinoam. And you might think to yourself, why is David marrying multiple wives? Well, keep in mind that at this time, there's a lot more at stake maybe in marriage than what we would know today. If you think about David's position, if you marry into the right family, and if you can marry into enough families, you put yourself in a good position if you're a king. And you see this throughout the Old Testament, sometimes where either the king of Israel or the king of Judah will offer his son or daughter in marriage to another king, and that's supposed to either build up an alliance or to sort of end animosity between two parties. But for whatever reason, David marries two women in this chapter, probably for that reason, to help strengthen him, to get him good connections, we might could say. Plus, we know that kings were doing that at this time. Perhaps that was a byproduct of it. But I wanted to note specifically verse 44. And this is something that we probably we haven't thought about when he's marrying these two women. We know from verse 44 that David has not seen Michal since David left the first time, back in, I believe it was chapter 20, right, where Michal told David that Saul and his men were waiting outside their home to take David's life, and David then went on the run. We haven't read about Michal since then, and we know why. Verse 44, it's that because after those events happen, Saul takes his daughter, you call her Michal or Michal, and he decides to give her to another man, right? Phalti, the son of Laish, which was of Gallim. Don't really know much about him, but we do know that, again, Saul had great disdain for David. At some point out, Saul giving his daughter-in-law, or giving his daughter and taking her away from his son-in-law, was a sign that obviously things were bad between David and Saul. We might say that this is one way in which Saul tried to kick David out of the family, by taking his daughter and giving her to another man, rather than letting her be with her husband David. And so perhaps that also explains why he takes two new wives. Maybe he doesn't know what's happened to Michal. We'll see more about her in 2 Samuel chapter 3. But those are a couple of things to keep in mind, maybe as a couple of reasons why David decides to marry two more women in that chapter. But we want to get to the main focus tonight, which is, again, chapter 26. We're going to try to get down through verse 12. And this is a chapter in which we probably could entitle that David spares Saul again. David spares Saul again. So as we begin with this section tonight, there are a couple of things that, again, I want us to think about before we start reading through this section. First of all, we think about the idea that, we think about the idea that Christians have the responsibility to look out for the spiritual state of others. We know that to be true. That's what the apostles a lot of times did in the letters that they wrote to these congregations, either to check up on them or like letters like 1 Corinthians and Galatians. They are sort of trying to tell the congregation to get better, to get right, in some cases fix problems, because the writers knew they had the responsibility to look out for the spiritual welfare of their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. And we understand that to be a responsibility as a Christian, right? We're not in this together. We're not all different races. We're not all on a different course, we could say, as Christians, and we're running or fighting this life alone. We're all in it together, right? We're all have the responsibility of watching out for each other, which includes watching out for the spiritual state of others, warning others about sin, and trying to help them if they struggle with certain things. We're going to see that come to light by the end of the chapter when we talk about David and Abishai, and David's recognition of that role in that particular point. So keep that in mind as we go forward. Also keep in mind just the general idea that sometimes if we develop a taste for something, that can lead to a very bad addiction. And think about it like this, right? How nice would it be if cake and donuts tasted like broccoli, and broccoli tasted like cakes and donuts, right? That would be great, right? Because then I wouldn't have, I like broccoli, but say it's Brussels sprouts. I don't like Brussels sprouts. If Brussels sprouts tasted like cake and donuts, I'd never have a problem eating Brussels sprouts. I'd eat them all the time because I like the taste of it. And we know the reasons why we can't eat cake and donuts all the time is that if I eat too much of it, it does bad things for me medically, right? Whether that's diabetes and other type of health issues, you would develop those problems. And so we understand that we while we might have a taste for it, we have to sort of rein ourselves in. Sometimes and the point spiritually being is that sometimes we can develop a taste maybe for certain temptations. And if we don't know how to rein that taste or that desire in, it can lead to a lot of greater problems. And that's something else that I want us to think about when we're comparing Saul and David here. Saul had a taste for things that were not good, but he didn't have any problem giving in to that initial good taste, no matter how bad the aftertaste was, or how bad the end result of we could say figuratively eating that particular temptation or giving into it. David was sort of the opposite, and we'll note that as we go forward in the chapter. That may be a little bit confusing as we begin, but I'll try to help point out how that idea ties in with what we're looking at. All right, so one thing to keep in mind as we begin this section, at least just a very basic point, there are some people that think that this is basically another story, or that think that this is the same story as chapter 24, but written by a different person. There are a lot of similarities in this chapter compared to the first time that David spares Saul's life, right? Some of those similarities are that, again, David's in the wilderness running from Saul, right? That's a similarity. The similarity there's another similarity in that again, David had the opportunity to kill Saul, but does not because he recognized Saul as God's anointed. Now, that's something that's similar between 24 and 26. Likewise, we'll see that Saul commends David by the end of this encounter, and that's another similarity between the two chapters. And there are some that would say that those two chapters are actually the same event but written by different authors, but we're going to note that there are some very important differences that show that this is indeed a separate account, and that it's not someone else retelling the same story. All right, so let's look at verses 1 and 2. And and within these first two verses, we're already going to start to note some of those differences that show these are two separate events. All right, beginning in verse 1. The Ziphites came unto Saul to Gibeah, saying, Doth not David hide himself in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon? Then Saul arose and went down to the wilderness of Ziph, having 3,000 chosen men of Israel with him to seek David in the wilderness of Zoph, or in the wilderness of Ziph. All right, so we see that the Ziphites appear again, right? They were there in chapter 23. We recall when Saul had David trapped, but then Saul went to go fight the Philistines, and then chapter 24 took place. Keep in mind that the Ziphites originally told Saul about David's location in chapter 23. And if you remember, Saul praised them for helping him when no one else would. And so Saul thought very highly of the Ziphites. We know that David did not, and we pointed this out, Psalm chapter 54, verse 3. When David is talking about the Ziphites, he called them strangers and oppressors, even though, as we pointed out, that the Ziphites were of the tribe of Judah, just like David was. He did not think very highly of them because they helped Saul out in this matter. Now, we do know that David is basically in the same location. If you go back and look at chapter 23, verse 19, you again see the hill of Hachilah and which is before Jeshimon. You see that in 26, verse 1 as well. Now, this is where the differences perhaps begin to appear. All right, so a natural question to ask here is, why would the Ziphites tell Saul about David's location again? Because the last time we read about the Ziphites and their encounter with Saul, we remember how that ended, right? The end of chapter 24, right? Saul acknowledged that David would become the next king. David and Saul went away in peace. We look back at chapter 22. Saul returns home. David and his men return to the stronghold where they're at, or perhaps move farther into Judah. And so it seems like when chapter 24 ended, things were fine between David and Saul. So when we come to chapter 26, why then are the Ziphites thinking that Saul wants to attack David again, when we know what happened at the end of chapter 24? Well, this is where it's important to note these differences. And generally, I don't like, the details here are sometimes a little bit boring maybe, but they are very important to show that these are two separate events. And I want to note these differences as we're going forward. Chapter 24, verse 22. All right, in that chapter, when David and Saul spoke, it's important to note that this was a private conversation. When David and Saul spoke in chapter 24, they had that discussion. It's basically a private discussion. Perhaps David told his men, but we don't read about Saul's men in that chapter. In fact, if you look at chapter 24, verse 22, David swearing to Saul, Saul went home, but David and his men gat them up unto the hold. You know that Saul's men are not mentioned there. So what it indicates to us is that Saul's confession and that oath that he mentions in 24 was done in secret. Saul's men apparently didn't know about that. And if that's the case, the Ziphites may not have known about that as well. You know, Saul's kind of embarrassed by this entire occasion. Saul likewise is probably not going to tell a lot of people about that embarrassment, because again, it's just David and Saul that are talking. Perhaps what happened at the end of chapter 24, again, the text says that David swearing to Saul. Saul went home and David and his men went back to the hold. Perhaps what happens here is that Saul went home after this event and didn't tell his men about what had happened. So the idea being that they searched for David for a while in verse 22, but because they couldn't find him, they decided to return home, not realizing, at least Saul's men and the Ziphites, not realizing that Saul had already met David. And if that's the case, and the Ziphites didn't know about what happened in 24, then it makes sense that the Ziphites, they hear that David's back in the territory again, and they tell Saul, you know, we've got David here. Why don't you come and take him and attack him? And so the Ziphites may not have known that the events of chapter 24 had taken place. And so that helps us understand maybe why they acted again. there's also something that ties in with chapter 25 that helps us as well. That's very important to understand. In 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 42, we're told that one of the grandsons of Caleb was a man named Ziph. Now, who do you think the Ziphites got their name from? Ziph, right? Ziph. Ziph was the father of the Ziphites, we might could say. Ziph was a descendant of Caleb. The Ziphites would have also been descendants of Caleb. Now, who was killed in chapter 25? Right? Who suffered the stroke in chapter 25? Nabal, right? And what was said about Nabal in chapter 25, verse 3? Yeah, he's of the house of Caleb. In other words, the Ziphites and Nabal, if Nabal's not a Ziphite, Nabal would have at least been relatives to the Ziphites. They were related to one another. So, with Nabal dying, David has basically married to Abigail. Perhaps he's gained Nabal's old possessions and prominence. Maybe now the Ziphites recognize that not only is David an enemy to Saul, but also David's a powerful rival to them in the area because of his marriage to Abigail. And considering how they had betrayed David before, perhaps, again, the Ziphites are afraid that David would, if David became king, the Ziphites could face punishment for that. But those are a couple things to keep in mind. It also shows the difference here, right? Chapter 25 is important to this story because the Ziphites and Nabal were obviously related to one another. Perhaps that motivated them to, once again, try to get Saul to kill David. There's also a difference that comes out here in verses 3 through 5. And that's that David will learn about Saul's arrival before he meets Saul. All right, verses 3 through 5. Verse 3, Saul pitched in the hill of Hachilah, which is before Jeshimon by the way. But David abode in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. So if you remember there at the beginning, I was talking about, how sometimes if we develop a taste for something bad, it can lead to a bad addiction. Perhaps this helps us understand why Saul changed his mind over and over again, right? Because at the end of chapter 24, the last time we read about Saul said, I'm not going to pursue after David. But now here comes the Ziphites along, and they provide Saul that opportunity, right? That temptation. We figured out where David's at. We're not going to let him go. This is a perfect opportunity for you, Saul, to go and to take out David, right? And perhaps Saul, that taste of jealousy, perhaps he recognizes that opportunity and that temptation is just too good to pass up. They got David right in the crosshairs, so to speak. And so perhaps Saul decides to act on that. When you think about a man like Saul, we could say he's very fickle, right? What does it mean if somebody's fickle?
Flip-flops. One thing one time and one thing another time.
Yeah, he flip-flops. He's not consistent. You remember what James said about an inconsistent individual. James chapter 1, verse 8. James talked about how a double-minded man leads to instability, or a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And he later on says in that letter, in James chapter 4, verse 8, that those who were double-minded or flip-floppers, that they needed to purify their heart, get their heart right so that they don't flip-flop. And the point being there is that, if you have that inconsistency, if you think about it like here with Saul, perhaps we could say that Saul needed to learn that the aftertaste of jealousy, or giving in to jealousy, the aftermath of it is much nastier than the initial pleasure of getting revenge, right? And that's what David learned in the last chapter, right? We saw that, right? David was told by Abigail, and he learned that the end result of not getting revenge was so much better for him than giving in that immediate moment and getting revenge. But Saul is different than David because Saul doesn't think about the aftermath of these consequences. And so he pursues after David. Now, here's something also that is different, right? In chapter 24, David basically stumbled upon Saul, right? Saul went into the cave to relieve himself, And it sort of just happened that David and his men figured out Saul was there. But here the indication is that David knew ahead of time that Saul was in the area. Again, that's verse 3. But David abode in the wilderness, and he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness. So verse 3, the indication is that David somehow heard about Saul's presence there. I know it says that he saw that Saul came after him into the wilderness, but the idea is that he heard some information that Saul might be in the area. That's why when we come to verse 4, David therefore sent out spies and understood that Saul was come in very deed. Or David heard Saul was in the area. David sent out his men to make sure that what he heard was correct. And that's the case. Saul is in the area. And so now David has the advantage here, right? He has the advantage because he knows where Saul's at. He has the opportunity to devise a plan for a possibly to take out Saul. He has that opportunity. Let's go ahead and look at verse 5. It says that David arose and came to the place where Saul had pitched, and David beheld the place where Saul lay, and Abner the son of Ner, the captain of his host, and Saul lay in the trench, and the people pitched round about him. And so, all right, so what we know from verse 5 is that David goes and he looks at the camp, right? That's the importance. He beheld the place where Saul slept, where Abner slept, where the people were laying, the army of Saul were laying sort of around where Saul was positioned. David was able to look at the schematics, or the sort of like the blueprint of how the camp was laid out. And he had all of the opportunities here to plan out an attack against Saul. But again, David's going to, as we mentioned, David's going to refuse the taste of temptation because he knows the end result of it is not beneficial to him at all, even though David has all of these things to his advantage. Now, you think about the opposite of that. What if Saul had all of these advantages to his own? He knew exactly where David was at. He could look straight at David's camp and group and know how to attack it. He'd have the advantage of surprise. If Saul had all of those advantages with him, from what we know about Saul, we know that Saul would have attacked and killed David, because we've seen him doing it on other opportunities. But here's the contrast between Saul and David, right? Because David has all of these advantages, and yet he never chooses to do harm to Saul. And that's a very important difference. A very important difference. All right, so I've noted at least 3 important differences between the two. And again, I reiterate these differences because there are critics of the Bible that say that this is one single account written by 2 different authors. But we know that it's 2 different accounts written by one author. All right, so having noted that, here's another important difference that comes in verse 5. David and Saul in chapter 24 had a private encounter, but you note in verse 5 that there are other people present here, right? Abner and Saul's army, right? Saul was within the encampment. The idea is that Saul laid in the trench and the people pitched round about him. Saul is much more heavily guarded now, right? Saul is basically on his own in chapter 24, but he's heavily guarded now. But the presence of Saul's men and Abner is going to be very important, as we're going to see in a moment. All right, let's look at verses 6 through 12, or at least a few of these verses. So David has observed the camp. We know that there are 2 men with him. So verse 6, David's observed the camp. David had said to Ahimelech the Hittite and to Abishai the son of Zeruiah, brother of Joab, saying, who will go down with me to Saul to the camp? And Abishai said, I will go down with thee. All right, so let's talk for a minute about these 2 individuals. All right, Ahimelech. We don't know very much about him. This is the only time in the Bible where he is mentioned. We know that he is a Hittite. There's one other Hittite specifically mentioned by name in 1 and 2 Samuel. And we should be familiar with him, but who was that Hittite? Uriah, right? And we'll talk about him with David and Bathsheba later on. The Hittites were a people that lived in central Turkey, but their territory went down to the northern boundary of Israel, right? So these are not people that are necessarily native to Canaan. They're not also Israelites. Perhaps they converted to Judaism. Abishai, on the other hand, we do know a little bit more about him. You know there that he is Joab's brother. And how do we know, what do we know Joab for?
He's sort of Saul's, David's military commander-in-chief or general, whatever you call him.
Yeah. So Joab, we'll know later on, he basically becomes the head of David's military, right? He's sort of David's right-hand man in military matters. You also know that he is the son of Zeruiah. And Zeruiah is actually a sister of David. And we get that from 1 Chronicles 2, verse 16. So if Abishai is the son of Zeruiah, what would that make him in connection to David? It'd be a nephew, right? Zeruiah is his sister, or David's sister. That means Abishai is David's nephew. And so we see that Abishai decides to go with David, right? Verse 6. All right, verse 7, they go into camp. David and Abishai came to the people by night, and behold, Saul lay sleeping within the encampment, and his spear stuck in the ground at his bolster, but Abner and the people lay round about him. Again, why would you sneak into camp if you're David? Right? That's a question I think it's natural to ask here, right? Saul's been pursuing after you. Saul wants to take your life. Right? Conventional wisdom says that you need to get as much distance between you and the person that's trying to take your life as you possibly can. You know, if we put ourselves in David's position, we know that somebody's after us. You know, we're not just going to go walk up to their doorstep, knock on the door and say we're here. Right? We're not going to get close to them. We're going to try to put as much distance as we can between the two individuals. Yet David's proposition here is that they go into camp. Well, this ties in with the importance of all those people being there. Saul in private had acknowledged that David would be king. Saul in private, as we saw in chapter 24, acknowledged that David was more righteous than him, right? That David was in the right. But none of those words were said in front of Saul's own men, right? Saul did not have to admit that publicly in front of his own men. So perhaps, and David recognizes this, he goes into the camp and, as we'll see in a moment, basically gives the indication that he could have taken Saul's life. Not only is Saul once again going to see David's innocence concerning all the things that Saul had said about him, but now Saul's own men, and perhaps the Ziphites, will recognize that David is innocent. From all those charges that Saul said about David, that he was trying to take his life, when Saul's men see what David does, you know, they're not going to have an excuse in saying, you know, we pursued David because Saul told us he was an enemy. They're not going to have that excuse anymore because David's going to prove his innocence, not just before Saul, but before Saul's entire army, or at least the men that have come with him. And so, helps us explain why David goes into the camp. Right? He's going to demonstrate his innocence to all these individuals. Right? So we note in verse 7 that Saul's spear laid beside him. We know that Saul loved that spear, right? He used it on 2 separate occasions to try to kill David. Generally, we're told that when the spear is stuck in the ground, as is described there, right? The spear is stuck in the ground. The idea, again, is that the spear is sort of standing upright, compared to the ground. We're told that what that indicates is that it indicated the residence of the leader, right? So when everybody's asleep, the way that David knew where Saul was at was because he sees the king's scepter sticking up out of the ground right beside Saul. And that's the importance of that. It's not like David and Abishai are sitting there trying to, you know, walk over and have to get right in the faces of some of those soldiers to figure out who Saul is. They know who he is because of that spear sticking out. And that's why that's mentioned there. Now note what Abishai says here in verse 8. Right? Abishai sees a perfect opportunity. Abishai says to David, God hath delivered thine enemy into thine hand this day. Now therefore let me smite him, I pray thee, with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. Right? And here's the perfect opportunity. All of the men are asleep. Abishai knows that somebody's messed up. David knows this as well because he's going to mention it later on to Abner. But somebody's messed up here. Right? The most important person within the camp, the king, you're not going to leave him defenseless. There's got to be somebody that's awake, that's basically standing guard of him. But you know what is said there in verse 7, right? All the individuals, right, are asleep. Perfect opportunity. David and Abishai are probably military men. And with you know, if you ever watch some of those shows, or if you've ever met somebody within special forces in the military, you know, within some of those special forces, one of the things that they are taught is how to take out somebody silently. And maybe David, with his military experience, he knows how to do that. And the point being is that if they do everything right, they can kill Saul without alerting his men, and thus they can get out of camp. And Abishai recognizes this, right? But you know that he doesn't say, David, why don't you take the spear and kill them? He says, let me do that. Again, I pray thee, therefore let me smite him, I pray thee. Abishai saying, let me take Saul's life. And that's because Abishai probably knew about what had happened in chapter 24. David said he was not going to stretch forth his hand. He was not going to kill the Lord's anointed. That was David's mindset. However, Abishai is basically saying here, if you're not going to do that, let me do it. Let me take the spear. Let me take Saul's life. And as he says there, I'm going to take it and thrust him through with the spear even to the earth at once, and I will not smite him the second time. Or in other words, I can take the spear and in one single push or one single thrust, I can kill Saul and no one's going to know what happened. And your hands are going to be completely clean of the matter, David, because I'm the one who took the spear and I killed Saul. So you don't have to take up your hand against that. And Abishai says, again, basically, David, if I do this, you're not going to be responsible for it, is the indication there. But note what David says, and this is where, when we think about our responsibility to look out for the spiritual welfare of other people, this is where this comes in with David. David says here, verse 9, Abishai, that's not the right thing to do. And David said to Abishai, destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? In one sense, David would obviously see that he is responsible for killing Saul if he allowed Abishai to take Saul's life. Abishai is under David, and while Abishai says David could plead ignorance, David knows that if he allows Abishai to do this, David's just as guilty as Abishai. He knows it's not the right thing to do. But you also note that he tells Abishai it's not the right thing for you to do, right? Destroy him not, for who can stretch forth his hand against the Lord's anointed and be guiltless? In other words, David recognizes and points this out to Abishai. You know, you might think that I may be guiltless of this, but that doesn't mean that you won't be. You will still be guilty of taking the life of the Lord's anointed, right? Don't do this. You're going to be guilty as well. And so you have a picture here of David watching out for the spiritual state of his own nephew, watching out for the spiritual state of others. And that's why he points it out, right? He doesn't allow Abishai to follow through and to commit sin because he's concerned about his nephew's spiritual state. And you think about that in contrast to other Bible characters, right? We remember when we talked about Saul with the priest of Nob, right? Saul wasn't going to put his hands and personally kill all of the priests of Nob, but Doeg the Edomite, on the other hand, we can allow him to kill all the priests. We can allow his men to kill all the priests. And that's what Saul did. And Saul probably thought to himself that he was guiltless because his hands didn't actually commit the crime. We know in the New Testament when Pilate had heard the words of Jesus and listened to Jesus testify before him and listened to the charges against Jesus, Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, right? But what did he do in response to that? He washed his hands, right? He said, it's not my responsibility anymore. If they killed Jesus, not my responsibility. That was the meaning behind the idea of washing his hands. I'm absolving myself from responsibility because I'm not going to be the one that puts my hands on Jesus to kill him. But David, on the other hand, recognizes, if I know about this happening and I allow it to happen, then I'm just as guilty as the person who kills Saul. And I'm not going to allow my nephew to be corrupted by that. I'm not going to allow my own self, right, to be corrupted by that. So David says, verse 10, David said, furthermore, as the Lord liveth, the Lord shall smite him, or his day shall come to die, or he shall descend into battle and perish. And so we know that this is certainly reinforced by what happened last chapter, right? David wanted to take revenge, but he saw how God took vengeance in his own time. If the events of chapter 25 didn't happen, David may not have the same strength to reject his nephew's opportunity, right? But the events of chapter 25, certainly the words of Abigail, you can hear those words being repeated by what David says there, right? God will take care of that time, or take care of this matter in his own time. And we see later on by the end of the book, that's indeed what happens. David, though, says, verse 11, again, the Lord forbid that I should stretch forth mine hand against the Lord's anointed, but I pray thee, take thou now the spear that is at his bolster, and the cruse of water, and let us go. And this will be the last verse that we cover tonight. But there is some importance with taking the spear and taking the water. Just as David took part of the robe of Saul to show that he could have taken Saul's life, David goes and with Abishai take Saul's instrument of war, something very valuable to Saul. They take the water that was sitting out beside Saul, the cruse of water, as it says there. And that's very important because if David takes Saul's own spear, if he takes Saul's basically little container of water, it shows how close David actually got to Saul. It's not like David got there on the outskirts of the camp and he took up one of the other soldiers' weapons that was on the outside, or one of the soldiers' container of water. No, he took Saul's own possessions to show how close David got to taking Saul's life. And that adds a lot more emphasis there because David was right there in Saul's face, could have taken his life. And that's going to add a lot more weight as we go forward. But I do want to stop for a moment and just point out again, as we're thinking about this as Christians, how important it is for us to make sure we're looking out for the spiritual welfare of other people. Certainly we don't want to be busybodies. We know, as we talked about in the class in 1 Thessalonians, right? Paul warned them about doing that because of their idleness. But again, we should have a concern about the spiritual state of other people, and especially our own brothers and sisters in Christ. And we can never have the mindset when we know something wrong is going on that, we can allow that to continue to go on. It's not going to affect me, or it's not going to make much of a difference, or I'm not going to be responsible knowing that someone's struggling with something, or someone is hurting because of a particular sin. We can't avoid responsibility in that matter. We have a responsibility not to look the other way, but to look to help out people that are struggling spiritually. And David is a good example of an individual that did this, because he doesn't let Abishai commit a particular sin. He keeps him from doing that. Just likewise, part of our responsibilities as Christians is to help prevent each other from falling into sin, and doing what we can to help prevent that, just as David's doing here. With that being said, are there any comments or thoughts that you'd like to add on before we end class tonight?
Well, the Bible says envy or jealousy is the rottenness of the bones, and that's very well portrayed in Saul's life. It seems like every waking moment, all he can think about is how am I going to get David? He'll say he's sorry, but like you said, it comes full circle right back to the jealousy and the envy, and it's just as addictive as a drug or whatever. And you let it eat at you like that.
Yeah, and Saul never got that in check either. And even though Saul keeps getting away with it, at least it seems like it eventually catches back up to him, as we'll see by the end of the book. But good thoughts. Any other comments before we close tonight? If not, we'll pick up in verse 12. We'll try our best to get through the end of the chapter next week, but we'll pick up 1 Samuel chapter 26 and verse 12 next Wednesday night.